For those of you who grew up on a steady diet of Disney movies, you've probably seen the animated 101 Dalmatians at least once. Maybe you saw the 1996 live-action movie with Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil. Maybe you remember the animated spin-off series on the Disney Channel. But either way, keen-eyed viewers might have noticed something in the opening credits of the movies, based off of the novel by Dodie Smith. That's right. Originally published in 1956, this was a novel before Disney bought the rights to turn it into a movie. But what a lot of people probably don't know is that following the release of the animated Disney movie, Smith published a sequel to 101 Dalmatians called Starlight Barking. The animated movie was fairly close to Smith's novel with a few notable deviations, the first being that Pongo's famous wife was not actually Perdita in the novel, but only ever just referred to as Mrs. Pongo or simply just Mrs. Perdita was actually a wet nurse for the puppies that Mrs. Darling found on the side of the road. She was another Dalmatian, but a liver-spotted one. That is to say that instead of the signature black spot, she had brown spots. When Pongo and Misses left in search of their stolen puppies, Perdita remained in London in order to comfort the Dearlys. Missing altogether from any movie adaptation was the inclusion of Mr. de Vil. In the original book, he was a quiet, almost henpecked man with a profession as a furrer. I'll give you 3 guesses why Cruella married him, and the first 2 don't count. Cruella mentioned that to Mr. Dearly that since she was the last of her line, she made her husband take her family name. Mr. Dearly had usually been some kind of artist in movie adaptations, except for the recent Cruella movie where he was a corporate lawyer. But in the book, he was an accountant who had gained notoriety when he helped England clear its national debt. Hell Hall, the de Vil's home in the English countryside, was not some ancestral home. It was actually just a random estate that the couple had purchased and then painted in order to match Cruella's aesthetic. The de Vils also had a white cat that Cruella mentioned as being a very expensive cat, which I took to mean that it was a Persian. The cat, like all animals in the story, hated Cruella exceptionally. At the end of the book, all of the dogs returned to London, and the cat called to the dogs and asked them to come inside and destroy the de Vil's fur collection. This included things like Cruella's signature white fur coat, but also their fur bedsheets, as well as every piece of fur that Mr. de Vil had been keeping at the house for his work. The dogs did so happily, much to the chagrin of the de Vils. By the end of the novel, they were without product and forced to close up their fur business. The Dearlys mentioned offhandedly that the de Vils were to leave England and open up a business manufacturing and selling plastic raincoats. They also put Hell Hall up for sale, and this is where the Dearlys moved in with their 101 Dalmatians. The white cat also moved in with them at the end of the book. And finally, also missing from any movie adaptation was the inclusion of the sheepdog's little human child, Tommy. He was about 2 years old in the first novel, and the innocence of babyhood allowed him to sort of be able to communicate with his family's sheepdog. And you might be wondering why it is that I'm telling you all of these seemingly insignificant details about the book. As some of you might have already guessed, these are all plot points that are relevant to the sequel. Starlight Barking takes place a couple of years following the first book. All of the puppies are now grown with children of their own. One day Pongo wakes up late and is worried about the Dearlys because they won't wake up. And he and Mrs. investigate. They receive a message from their smallest daughter, Cadpig. She was the one who was born mostly dead, and Mr. Dearly rubbed her until she revived. She was also the runt of the litter. Now, thanks to Mr. Darling's work with government finances, he often had meetings with the Prime Minister. One day, when he went to London, Cadpig stowed away in his car because she really wanted to meet the Prime Minister, and when it was time to leave, she just decided to stay. The citizens of England loved to see Cadpig on TV with the Prime Minister, despite his low political rating. But since she was living in London and Hell Hall was several miles away, it would have been downright impossible for the dogs at Hell Hall to hear her. But on this particular morning, they're able to hear her as if she was just next door. How? Through telepathy, of course. Cadpig tells the dogs at Hell Hall that all of the humans and animals alike are asleep, except for the dogs. She also tells them of another power that she's discovered called swishing. It's basically the ability to move quite fast. Cadpig asks for her parents, as well as most of her brothers and sisters, to come to Downing Street to help her with this problem of everybody being asleep. Most of the Dalmatians swish to London, leaving behind those with puppies, as well as the fathers of those puppies. Some of their other new abilities are that they are never hungry, thirsty, or tired. Another is that whenever a dog needs at any given time might happen around them. So when a dog needs into a room with a closed door, the door will open. Or when Pongo went in to look up the meaning of the word metaphysical, the dictionary fell off the shelf and opened to the exact page that he needed. After arriving in London, the sheepdog contacts them to say that his boy Tommy has woken up from the coma, also the white cat as well as the barn cat. They are under the impression that because of the closeness of all three to the dogs and their help in saving the puppies, they were dubbed as honorary dogs, which is why they woke up. However, they can't swish, and as Tommy grew older, he lost his ability to speak with his family's sheepdog, but Tommy's awakening in this dog world gained him half of his old ability to speak with the sheepdog, who is the only one who can understand him. Once they get to London with the help of some of the Dalmatians left at Hell Hall, the White Cat suggests that maybe Cruella de Vil is behind this. They'd heard that the de Vils had come back to England after the plastic raincoat thing washed out. As they discuss this possibility, the Dalmatians are also determined that they should kill her, which, considering that she's literally the only villain whose sole motivation was simply because she wanted a fur coat, I'm completely and utterly in favor of this. However, at the de Vil's old house in London, they find both Cruella as well as her husband asleep like every other human, and this somehow means that they can't kill Cruella, but they're determined to destroy their belongings again. However, much to their chagrin and my continuing bewilderment over this book, the thing that Cruella is sleeping under is not a sheet of plastic used to make a raincoat, but rather it is a sheet of metal, and in the closet there are literally various pieces of armor. Following washing out of the plastic raincoat business, it seems as though the de Vils went to found another company called Clothes That Clank, which, sure, why not? Dejected, the dogs leave the de Vil house with no more answers than when they'd gone in. After a while, a voice comes over the televisions and instructs all dogs to be outside where they can look up at the stars at midnight. All dogs think that the voice sounds like some human that they love very much, so Pongo hears Mr. Darling, Mrs. hears Mrs. Darling, and Cadpig hears the Prime Minister. There is some time between when they get the message and midnight, so the dogs decide to go to the zoo, which is not something that dogs can do under normal circumstances. When they're trying to get back, they find the road so clogged with other dogs since everybody has come to London. This is when Mrs. thinks, if anything we think of happens today, why can we not simply fly above the heads of everybody? So they do. Pongo and Misses literally start to fly. At midnight, a star seems to fall towards the earth, where it hovers over a statue in the park where the dogs are all gathered and takes on the form of another dog. However, what kind of dog it is depends on who is asking. The Dalmatians see another Dalmatian, the sheepdog sees another sheepdog, and so on and so forth. This being introduces itself as the dog star Sirius. And by this point, we've already seen dogs with telepathic abilities flying over London, so the introduction of Sirius is something that I barely blinked about. Sirius tells all of the dogs that the humans are going to blow up the Earth, and Sirius wants for all of the dogs on Earth to come live in space with him. It's also worth mentioning that this book came out in 1967. People were on edge because of the Cold War, and the first country nations of the world are also embroiled in the space race to be the first nation to put a man on the moon, just to put this novel into some ongoing cultural context. Sirius also reassures the dogs that if they choose to come with him, that the humans will forget that dogs ever existed, that he'll also remove things like kennels and leashes so that humans don't wonder what those things were for. However, the decision to leave Earth must be mostly unanimous, and he decides to leave the decision up to Pongo. Now, most dogs don't actually want to leave Earth. They have a good life, so Pongo is certain that he should stay. But after a while, some stray mutts come to Pongo. And I thought that they were going to talk about going with Sirius simply because they are strays with no home. But they say that if all the dogs go with Sirius, then all the dogs will go along to Sirius. And that's a lot of dogs to a single owner. They say that their lives might be rough living on the streets of London, but that doesn't mean that they don't want to try to find people who will take care of them. Pongo goes back to Sirius and tells him thanks but no thanks. Sirius then tells all of the dogs that they need to return home before dawn and that their powers will stop working after that. He goes on to say that everybody will wake up after this and it'll be like they hadn't lost an entire day because of this. So the dogs go home and everybody else wakes up. The dogs continued to live on Earth, and the Dalmatians in hell, and life went on. This book was completely and utterly ridiculous, but in a super fun way. I'm honestly kind of disappointed that this was the first time that I'm ever hearing about this book and that it's never been adapted into a movie before. Disney is out there making stinkers such as Cruella, but they've been ignoring Starlight Barking this entire time. Random other fact is that instead of Horace and Jasper, the other man's name was Saul instead of Horace. I don't really know why they changed his name in Disney's original animated movie, but I felt like if they had changed it back to Saul in later movies, people would have complained too much about that. In an alternate reality, his name was left as Saul, and they have a TV series called Better Call Horace.